Welcome to the third tutorial of my Tableau Server Client series. This series is dedicated to showcasing how to use Tableau Server Client to automate various tasks. In this video, I will walk you through the process of querying your Tableau Server for the first time, but first, let us briefly discuss the benefits of querying your Tableau Server using Tableau Server Client. Understanding how to effectively query your Tableau Server using Tableau Server Client allows you to do the following. 1. Quickly answer questions related to the content or objects on your server. For example, how many users are licensed on the server and what are their roles? How much content and what type of content does each user own? 2. Create scripts automating site and server administration tasks because these scripts often require the server to be queried prior to a task being able to be completed and/or afterwards to confirm that the task was completed successfully. For example, we can query the server to get user A's content and automate the transfer of ownership from user A to user B. This task can be completed on a large scale for multiple users in seconds, allowing you to avoid several hundred, if not thousands, of manual clicks on Tableau Server's front end. 3. More easily and effectively manage your Tableau Server overall. Think about automation of onboarding and offboarding of users from the server. Onboarding could consist of subscribing a user to specific pieces of content and adding the user to specific groups, among other things. Offboarding could consist of transferring all the user's content to another user and subsequently removing the user from the server. Having briefly discussed the benefits, let's jump over to Visual Studio Code to begin writing our script to query the Tableau server. For this example, I'm going to send a request to my Tableau server to provide a list of all data sources existing on the server. After retrieving that list, I will create a simple data sources report that provides important details on each data source. For the first step, I need to configure my connection to Tableau server. If you are unfamiliar with how to configure a connection to your Tableau server for authentication purposes, please watch video 2 of this series. In that video, I walk through connecting to Tableau Server for the first time. I will also place the link to the video in the comments section. In the next step, I need to use the Tableau Server Client object I configured above to sign in. I'm using a context manager to ensure I stay signed in while attempting to access information on my Tableau server. Additionally, this ensures that I also sign out each time. To query my Tableau server for the list of data sources we're hoping to retrieve, I'm going to go ahead and run this configuration block here to create my Tableau Server Client object. And then I'm going to sign in. This block isn't doing anything currently because I'm just simply signing in. I'm not sending a request to retrieve the list of data sources. Let's go ahead and run this to make sure it works correctly. It does. Now, the next step we need to do is we need to send that request to gather the list of data sources. How might we do that? Well, what we can do here is we can say data sources equals. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use a list comprehension to gather all of these data sources on my Tableau server into a single list. Say data source for data source, then tsc.pager, and then server.data sources. So this list comprehension, what it's going to do is it's going to retrieve each data source on my Tableau server. And it's using this endpoint, server.data sources. So this is where we can find all of the Tableau data sources that are on my server. And how do I know that? So very quickly, let's just do server._dict to see which endpoints are connected to this object. You'll notice here that we have quite a few items in this dictionary. One of those is in fact data sources, and this is the Tableau Server Client's server endpoint for the data sources that are stored on your Tableau server. You also see a variety of other things that probably you're familiar with, so workbooks, favorites, flows, etc. That's how I know, right? So this is merely going through documentation, being familiar with the library, the Tableau Server Client library. So I'm going to do backspace that. Let's run this. So I'm going to run this block. And as a result, each of these data sources are going on my Tableau server are going to be represented within a list. So one data source object per data source in this list. And quick FYI, I'm using tsc.pager. This is going to allow me to paginate through the list of items on my server. So in this case, data sources. This is super helpful if your server has quite a few data sources. So I believe the page limits on here by default is 100. If you have more than 100, you may run this if you're not using tsc.pager, you may run this, you may try to retrieve your data source and you notice, hey, I don't have all of my data sources. And that's because I just retrieved the first page. You would need to manually iterate through to get subsequent pages. But what I would recommend again is using this because it does all the heavy lifting for you. I simply need to wrap my endpoint in tsc.pager, and it's going to go ahead and retrieve all the data sources on my Tableau server that I have access to. Okay, so let's look at what is data sources, right? It's a list of data source objects that I've captured. And you'll see here, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 data sources. And there's some information here that may not look familiar to you because if you've never queried the Tableau server before using Tableau Server Client, but this is going to be the locally unique identifier. It's how Tableau Server uniquely identifies each object on the server. This is the name of that object. There's no description. This is the parent project that the data source belongs to. Now, this is a little bit easier to look at and understand. So if you want to understand this object and see all of its attributes, what I would do is I would again just use _dict. You could also use vars if you wanted to, whatever you prefer. Data sources, and what I need to do is because this is a list, I need to just for example purposes, I'm going to access the first data source in this list and say _dict. You'll notice that each data source is going to have a fixed number of attributes, and some of these are particularly important. Like, so if we think about the locally unique identifier, we definitely typically are going to want that for reporting purposes. We're going to want the owner ID, so who owns the data source. We're going to want the data source name. We're going to want the project ID, the project name, the created date, so when was the data source created, and when was it last updated, right? So that's typically important. When was your data source created, and when was it last updated? So how can we unpack all this stuff, right? So we don't want it to look like this. We definitely don't want it to look like this. What we can do is we can use pandas to create a data frame. So what I'll do is I'll do that now. And I'll just say, create a data frame containing data source information. So let's do data source, I'll say data source info. Not the best name, but it'll work for this example. And let's do this. What I'm going to do is for each of the attributes that I want to pull out for each of those data sources, I'm going to use a list comprehension again. And I'm going to create this data frame by providing the column name and then the list of values for each of those data sources. So let's just start off with data source ID. So that's the unique identifier for the data source. And I'm going to say data source for data source. And I'm going to say data source because I need the ID attribute. So I'm going to say data source.id. So I'm going to pull out the ID attribute from this data source from each data source. And I'll say for data source and data sources. All right. So let's just run this very quickly just to see what's going on. I'm going to just pull out the data source ID for each data source. So I'm going to run this. And then let's look at data source info. What we should expect is we should see 6 unique identifiers, locally unique identifiers, 1 for each data source, since there's 6 data sources on my Tableau server. So I'm going to say data source info, and we see 6 unique identifiers. So that's what we're expecting. So let's complete this data source info data frame by adding the other relevant information that we previously spoke about. So I'm just going to go to the next attribute, and let's say data source owner ID. And what I'm going to do is, because this is going to be a lot of copy and paste, I'm going to say, just list out the things that we want. Data source name. What else? We want the data source project ID. We want the data source project name. So where is the data source located within our Tableau server? So project and Tableau server lingo, that's basically a folder. If you think about your file system on your local machine, that's a folder. So project name. And let's do data source created at. So when was the data source created? Data source updated at. When was it last updated? What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and paste this. So we're going to use the same strategy. So we're going to use list comprehension for extracting, each of the values from each data source. So what I'll do is copy and paste this. The only thing we need to switch out is the actual attribute that we're accessing for each of these data sources to pull out. So in this case, I'm going to say owner ID, and for project name, I'm going to say name. So this is the data source name, excuse me. And for project ID, I'm going to say project ID. Project name, say project underscore name. Data source created at, let's do, that is actually created at. And updated at, let's do updated at. And now what we have here is, instead of just a list of data source IDs standing by itself, which again, this information is not particularly useful to anyone, right? We don't memorize these data source IDs, but it is important to include these in the vast majority of your reports that you're going to be generating off of Tableau Server, because this is how you're going to uniquely identify a data source. Say if the data source you have multiple data sources that have the same name. This can come in handy. So if you have like let's just say for whatever reason you do UAT and you do production related development on the same server, and as a result you have two data sources with the same name, but they're stored in different projects. Using the ID, definitely helpful to get directly to the data source you want to do something with. All right, so let's run this code. This is going to create our complete data source info data frame. And then let's rerun this, see what we got. Okay, so what we have here is we have a very basic report that contains a variety of relevant attributes or pieces of information that describe each data source. So we have 6 data sources: the data source ID, the owner ID. So this is the user ID, the data source name. You can use this. So the importance of this is you can use this value, and I'll show this in later tutorials. You can use this value to look up, okay, I don't really care about this, but I need to use this for lookup purposes to find out who the user is, right? I want to know who owns this data source, not just their ID, but the actual name of the person. The data source name, the data source project ID, the project name, when it was created and when it was last updated. Now what I want to do very quickly before I wrap up this video, I want to jump over to my Tableau server to show you that this is actually the right information. So we won't be able to see the ID values, but we should be able to see the data source names, the project names, the created at and updated at timestamps. So let me just switch over to my Tableau server very quickly. And what I can do, I'm on my Tableau server. If I want to verify this information, what I can do is I can go to Explore, and then I'm just going to go to data sources. You'll see there's a 6, so 6 data sources on my server, and here they are. So data gaps, duplicates, North American sales, and so forth. Now, if we go back to our Visual Studio Code, our script, let's look at that. So North America sales, data gaps, duplicates, and the same exact information we saw on our server. So this is working correctly. We're getting all of the data sources off of our Tableau server and capturing relevant information pertaining to each data source. As you can see, being able to query your Tableau server is very powerful. Within seconds, I can answer questions that would otherwise involve significant manual effort. This is especially true if your server hosts a lot of content. The next 9 tutorials are dedicated to generating reports. I will walk you through querying various types of objects and show you how to write the details of those objects to an Excel file for reporting purposes. In the final tutorial on generating reports, I will show you how to create a master report that speaks to all object types discussed in the previous 8 tutorials. If you enjoyed this video, then please like the video and subscribe to my channel for notifications on future videos. Thank you again, and see you next time.